Dr. Leonard is a pharmacist and our chief, well, PharmD and DBAT, DABAT. He's our chief clinical officer. He's born and raised in Western Washington. Dr. Leonard holds a doctorate of pharmacy from Washington State University College of Pharmacy and is board certified in applied toxicology. Dr. Leonard completed a general pharmacy residency in Olympia, then moved to Maryland to complete a 2-year clinical toxicology fellowship at the Maryland Poison Center and the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. He came back to Washington State and the Washington Poison Center following 5 years of leadership positions at the Maryland Poison Center. Dr. Leonard leads all of the Poison Center's Washington Poison Center's call center services, provides oversight to the Poison Center's pharmacist and nurse specialist and poison information, and ensuring the Poison Center continues its provision of high quality treatment, advice, and consultation. Dr. Leonard advances our mission at the Poison Center to prevent and reduce harm from poisoning by cultivating relationships and collaboration with healthcare and public health entities across the state. I'm really happy to have Dr. Leonard here presenting for us today because I think he's an engaging and exciting presenter to listen to. I always enjoy time I get to hear him speak about topics. And thank you so much for joining us. And I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Justin. All right, we're going to talk about Kava, some of the risks, benefits, and then epidemiology, and things that have changed over time. And somebody asked, can we send the presentation? Yes, of course, I'm totally willing. So we're going to talk about some of the history of Kava and what we know. So Kava it's naturally derived. It comes from the plant. It's a cultivar of the Piper methysticum, which means intoxicating pepper. And it's native primarily to the South Pacific. Vanuatu, Fiji, Hawaii, and Samoa are some of the most widely cited regions where it comes from. There are multiple different cultivars that have evolved over thousands of years, specifically through intentional breeding. It grows about 10 to 15 feet in the air if you just let it keep growing. It's usually harvested at 6 to 10 feet or so. It actually is a sterile cultivar because it's been so heavily modified. And there are two main types that we think about, both the noble and the 2-day, or some people call it the 2-day. Sorry, there we go. There's a pretty extensive historical use. Like I said, it's been cultivated over about 3,000 years from cuttings from the Piper witchmani, which was the original parent. And then there are a lot of regional differences in how it's been prepared throughout history. In areas like Fiji, Tonga, and the Samoa, they generally would make, put parts of the plant into a mortar and pestle, crush it up, and then add it to like a lukewarm water. In Vanuatu, where it was used pretty extensively, they would have young children actually chew it up, chew up the leaf matter and other plant components, and then it would be expectorated into a coconut husk with some water and some coconut milk and mixed together. This is probably really important because in your mouth you have enzymes called amylases. They would actually break down some of the plant material and really impact the active ingredient availability. So we're already seeing significant differences in some of the clinical effects and some things that we see in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa compared to Vanuatu. They would generally have like two different types that would be used. Daily drinking, so people are just daily for relaxation. It would be primarily the noble cultivars, and then ritual and other specific events, they would pull out the 2-day cultivars. It's really important to note that yes, a lot of people were using it chronically, everyday kind of situation. Through much of this period, most people had, a lifespan of up to 40 years within these countries. So long-term use and long-term clinical effects really have not yet been described with this population, with people using Kratom or Kava. Additionally, later on, uh, Kava ended up moving to Europe. Specifically, the Germans had a documented use as early as the 1880s, and that was actually the very first documented use of it by a scientist with the last name of Lewin. And he actually discovered that all of the ingredients were in some sort of fat soluble matrix of the plant. And this was really important because they tried at other at previous junctures to extract out the active ingredients, and they'd done like, oh, we'll boil it in water and do these things, and nothing was working until he eventually said, hey, I'm gonna soak it in basically oil, or it was actually acetone or ethanol, and that allowed it to really be extracted out. But the mastication and the pounding did also help to extract it versus just boiling plant material. It's not just normal tea. He also identified there were some local anesthetic effects on the tongue and described that it would calm the mind, kind of make like a staying stable effect, but relaxed. And that was something that had been described, historically throughout traditional use. Going forward in Germany, 110 years or so, there were lots of different preparations available. People were, using uh, extracts. Some people had traditional products available. It was kind of mixed. In 1990, the German Health Authority actually accepted a monograph. So essentially said, yes, we agree that this can be used for as a drug to treat, nervous anxiety, tension, and restlessness. And then there was this surging demand in the Western countries because once they accepted it, it really took off throughout all of Europe. During that process, they actually shifted to 2-day cultivars because one, it had more of the active ingredients by weight, and it was really faster growing. So they were able to, harvest a plant in 12 months versus 5 years with the noble cultivars. And then one thing that we saw that started to occur was liver toxicity. We'll talk more about this later. So this was identified first in 1999. Has a pretty rare event, but it is likely, a real occurrence from Kava-related agents. This resulted in widespread bans throughout the European Union. I think Germany was the first one and a bunch of others. And then in 2002, the Food and Drug Administration put out an alert as well. They didn't ban its use or ban import, but they did say, hey, this is concerning. And they actually had 11 patients that had been using Kava and developed liver toxicity to the point of needing liver transplant. A quick note about liver toxicity, not necessarily related to Kava. It is one of, if not the most common reason for a drug pulled from the market, right? So whenever you're looking at risk of liver injury, you have to balance the risk of an untreated disease, alternative treatments, and liver toxicity. So in this example, people were using it for anxiety, and they said, yeah, there are other drugs that can be used for anxiety, and the liver toxicity risk is high enough. And when we look classically, our rates of withdrawn drugs are like 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100,000. So it can be really rare, and it's actually really hard to identify in studies, clinical trials. You have 1,000 people, great. 0.1 of them might develop liver toxicity. Well, you can't have 0.1 people. And so it usually happens in post-marketing. Honestly, if it happens early enough in during active clinical trials, it'll probably never even get approved. All right, moving through epidemiology, and we'll talk a little bit about what went on and has been going on with poison center calls. In 2000 and 2001, we were seeing about 500 calls or 450 calls per year reported to all poison centers. While that's not a huge number, it, it was still there. It was on par with things like early kratom exposure type calls. And then in 2002, the Food and Drug Administration put out an alert, and the European Union had done some banning as well. And we saw this precipitous drop in the number of Kava calls reported to all poison centers in the US throughout time. And then over the last few years, we've seen this like slow trend up that really seems to be tied to like more of a drive for more natural products and interest in products, outside of what's being sold by drug companies. The current epidemiology is honestly a little bit unclear in the US. There was a survey that was published this year by the senior author. His name is Oliver Grumman. He does a ton of stuff with natural product research. They had 10,000 people that started the survey and 2,000 that completed it. They estimated the last year prevalence for kava use is about 10.7% in the US, which is really high, but potentially believable. When we look at the kava group versus the no kava group, it was a shift towards more males had used it. They're more likely this younger 18 to 49, less likely to be 50 and older. They're all more likely to have college graduation or a higher education and actually considerably higher income. So we don't know the true epidemiology. It seems to be on the rise from a poison center standpoint, really tied to like access and use, and then estimated prevalence up to 10.7% in the US. We're going to talk about the pharmacology, and this should be friendly for all levels at this point. So, kava contains what are called kavalactones. The key ones are kavain, dihydrokavain, methysticin, dihydromethysticin, yanganin, and desmethoxyyanganin. Essentially, what we have is kavain, and then a slight modification to the molecule makes it dihydrokavain. The mechanisms are kind of all variable based on the different kavalactone. What we think is that it enhances GABA A activity. And to put that into perspective, what people know is that's really similar to things like ethanol and things like benzodiazepines, where they're really working on that GABA, and that GABA is a sedating channel that helps globally calm the body. They also work on a lot of other channels that have been shown in like studies where they just have cells and have animals, but how important that isn't totally clear. For those of you who are not, scientists, this is kind of description. I had Gemini create this, but I went through and make sure that everything's accurate, right? It's just much better at creating cartoons than I am. But essentially, this is your GABA channel, and your GABA channel allows chloride to flow through it. Chloride makes you calm and sedates and decreases the activity of a lot of your neurons firing. And so what we think kava does is it binds, and what it does is it just helps GABA work. Doesn't replace it, but it just kind of makes it so that like, oh, normally GABA causes the channel to open for, say, a second. Now it opens for a second and a half, right? That kind of thing. We're just really globally improving how well it works. It doesn't replace it. Things like benzodiazepines do very similar effects, and ethanol do as well. They just bind in different areas. There is a lot more complex components to the lactones, though. So GABA A is your big one. We think kavain also might impact things like some of your sodium channels, which may have impacts on the heart, probably just primarily on the brain. It blocks neurotransmitter reuptake, so things like dopamine and norepinephrine and epinephrine, and these actually are sometimes like calming molecules, or are really commonly modified in things like depression. Dihydrocavane, again, GABA A. We think that also has some beta antagonism effects, so or like a beta blocker. Propranolol is a really good example. This might actually be helping you with anxiety. Methysticin also seems to function on NMDA. This is what like PCP and ketamine work on. Dihydromethysticin really just it modifies some of your breakdown of neurotransmitters in the brain. The yanganin we think has impacts on CB1 or your cannabinoid receptor 1, although cannabinoid pharmacology is really way too much to get into here. And desmethoxyyanganin might have effects on CB2, which is your cannabinoid receptor 2. CBD is your classic one that's functioning on that. So it's kind of all over the board for how it works. Kind of means that it's really going to be a messy drug. To add to that messiness, there are differences with our cultivars. So I previously mentioned the growth rate is different. Our noble cultivar has a slow harvest, 5 years versus about a year. The cavalactone that's predominant is going to be different. So we see mostly cavane and methysticin with our noble cultivars versus dihydrocavane and dihydromethysticin with our 2-day cultivars. So you've got this like mixture of different chemicals in Kava, and then different cultivars are going to have different ratios of the mixtures. So the things that we'll see are all over the board. Cavane A and B, which is important from a liver failure standpoint, is minimal in our noble cultivars, and the 2 days have a much higher content. Clinical effects that we see with the noble cultivars are supposed to be just calming, chill, relax, not impaired. Versus with the 2-day, you can actually see stronger, long-lasting sedation, right? These were primarily used for special events, funeral rites, and other things, and really just trying to sedate people more heavily through whatever was going on. Duration is short versus 2-day literally lasts 2 days. So people are reporting up to 48 hours after using 2-day products. All right, what are our uses and benefits? Now, there's really limited randomized controlled trial data. There's some, but it's out there. If you look at survey data, things that we see that people state they use it for: pain relief, boost energy, relieve depression, mood, anxiety, relaxation, focus, sleep, which I don't know how you boost energy and boost sleep, although it could be that they sleep better, so they have more energy. Euphoria, reduce alcohol reliance, reduce prescription medications, smoking, be more social, muscle recovery, right? And when you look at the survey data, 80% of people say, I'm doing better because I'm taking this, right? I feel like this is really benefiting. But there is some data, randomized controlled trial data, which is really the important thing we want to see for determining if drugs are effective, right? So it's been studied for generalized anxiety disorder. It was studied in acute panic disorder. So somebody's having a panic attack. They compared it to placebo and oxazepam, which is a benzodiazepine. And what they said is it's not effective, right? It was no more effective than the placebo, and oxazepam really was effective. It sedated people through their panic attack. And then there's also pretty limited evidence for a maintenance therapy for people with, not stable generalized anxiety, but have, kind of a new episode of anxiety that, okay, you're going to get started on a treatment. In 2003, Cochrane Collaborative, which is a big group that reviews all the available literature and lumps it together to say this is effective or this is not effective. Reviewed 680 patients within studies, half of them placebo, half of them had Kava, and they said it may be beneficial compared to placebo in short duration trials. And most of these were like 8-week long studies, which frankly is not a really long time. Most people on treatment for generalized anxiety disorder are going to be on for, 6 months plus, like bare minimum. There was another study, because of this, some of these limitations in the previous trials, that was done in Australia. It was published in 2020. They enrolled about 170 patients, or 85 in each arm. Half withdrew before the end of the trial. So, it's kind of hard to determine, hey, half people didn't even finish their study. They included patients with generalized anxiety disorder, not on other drugs for it. So you couldn't be on something like, Lexapro or Zoloft. They treated them for 16 weeks. And what they found is there was no difference compared to placebo. No reduction in the anxiety score, no difference in the proportion of people who had at least a 50% reduction in their anxiety, no difference in remission. So no difference. So we got a cumulative about 850 patients across these 13 studies. The Cochrane review included a bunch, and this study. So a pretty limited population in generalized anxiety disorder and how much it's been studied there. For perspective, couple things that are really important for evaluating some of this literature. The placebo effect is really strong in anxiety studies. So almost 80% of the effect that happens with drug, we think is actually just placebo effect. So you have to see like significant increase on top of that. We usually see a remission rate of like 50% in our anxiety studies. We're seeing like 30% in a lot of these older trials. And then it's a pretty small population that's been studied in all things considered. For example, escitalopram, or the brand name Lexapro, was studied in about 2,500 patients across 6 studies for approval and immediate post-marketing versus, 850 people across 13 studies. And, more people in smaller studies isn't better than, one large study that's going to generally have better data. For insomnia, which the other thing that it's widely been cited for, there are no randomized controlled trials for pure insomnia. Sometimes people would say like, oh, we're going to do patients with anxiety and sleep disturbance. So maybe they study like 50 people that have that problem, half get placebo, half get Kava. Frankly, it's really mixed data. Some of the studies showed a little bit of benefit, some of them did not. So it's hard to interpret. And frankly, the verdict is we need better data, right? I'm not gonna say like, yep, I'm gonna just go randomly like start recommending Kava for anybody who says, can I use this for anxiety? Let's talk a little bit more about how people use Kava. Some of this comes from some survey data, some comes from others. So it's often brewed into shots, right? It's available as Kava bars. It's sometimes being sold as like an alternative to alcohol. It's not really saying like it's not saying we're not alcohol. It's saying we're not alcohol, right? We're drink this instead of. It's going to give you a different type of feeling. What happens now in more controlled situations, hopefully places where you're actually selling this commercially, is they'll do either cold mechanical extraction. This is something that people might do, at home, and essentially they'll like fill a bag full of kava powder, put it in some warm water, and then knead it pretty rigorously for a while. You might add in some like whole milk as well to help some of those fat soluble products come off. We can also blend it pretty continuously with warm water. The idea is that that's really just trying to break down any of the plant material and allow for the drug to be released, or the cavalactones to be released. Extraction isn't great, somewhere in the 15 to 40%. So the dose, honestly, I don't know what it is, but supposed to be somewhere between 150 and 300 milligrams, right? That's what's cited as a normal amount. And then people usually, will drink it chilled, and classically it was drunk as like pretty much a shot, not really sipped on like tea or coffee. Now, what we're seeing a lot more of is extracts and capsules that are being sold. Um, these are extracted in different ways. You can use the solvent method, which is either ethanol, acid, or acetone, because the plant is, the cavalactones are fat soluble. They're soluble also in ethanol and acetone. It extracts like 30 to 90%, so much higher yield. And then that just, dries off, and then you just have powder with cavalactones and everything else in the plant. And then there's a solventless method. Carbon dioxide extraction is another way. Again, 30 to 70% yield. This is sold sometimes, sometimes these are sold as capsules with doses in the 70 to 250 milligrams of cavalactones per capsule. And for perspective, in our RCTs, generally we were getting 75 to 250 milligrams per day. So people are, at least following the evidence, despite the fact that the studies and the evidence said probably no benefit. There have to be some risks, of course, and I'll go through these kind of one by one. These are really limited to case reports, right? People don't, these studies are so small, 30 patients and, or 60 patients, you're not going to identify pretty rare effects. So there's some muscle effects. There are a couple of published cases out there. One described a 34-year-old male who collapsed while riding his bicycle. He was actually found to have what's called rhabdomyolysis, or significant muscle breakdown, didn't have end organ or kidney injury along with it. He stated that he drank tea with kava a few times a week and had recently increased the amount of kava that he was drinking. So there may be some rare cases of direct muscle toxicity from cavalactones. It's possible, like I said, case reports only. There are some central nervous system effects. It may decrease your brain function speed, may cause some issues with walking. And then there's one case of drug-induced Parkinsonism. So essentially the person developed Parkinson's disease. I don't really, as I've parsed it out, I don't necessarily believe it. It's cited in a lot of the reviews, but after looking at the case, I just say like, yeah, maybe. So unsure on that one. But especially our 2-day cultivars are going to see your like decrease in brain function. Skin effects, and I have a couple of pictures. They're not too terribly gross. There's this widely described reversible scaly skin condition in Australia. It's called crocodile skin, as expected. It's most common in regular heavy users, and then South Pacific and Northern Australia is where we see it the most. There's a rash, may begin on the head, neck, and face, and then it moves more like generalized. There's these rough, dry, and scaly, and then polygonal scales. I'll show in the next picture. There's no erythema or redness and swelling, although some people may develop a little bit of flushing, and it may also develop some neuropathy or like tingling and nerve type pain. This is another picture of it. Again, fish-like scaling, polygonal, actually very interesting looking and unfortunate, but it's good that it's reversible at least. Other things that we see, it's a major concern, is drug interactions. So there are a lot of impacts on the breakdown of your drugs that people take. So things including like warfarin, which is a blood thinning medication. If you don't break it down adequately, you might, bleed out significantly. Phenytoin, which is a medication for seizures. If people overdose on it, they can fall and be at other risks. Other things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen and naproxen, may impact some of the metabolism there. And then our selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Lexapro, Zoloft, it may impact those metabolism. And then more importantly, other things we see are there are some drugs we take that are called prodrugs, meaning that it has to be converted in your body to be active. Losartan, which is really important for patients who have heart failure, is one of those key drugs, and then a bunch of the related agents. And then clopidogrel, which is a antiplatelet drug, also has similar effects. It needs to be activated, and some of these enzymes are involved in that activation. So if you're no longer have this antiplatelet after your heart attack, you're at risk of a blood clot and a secondary heart attack. And then moving past the individual agents, it's often consumed with other drugs, right? So you have to recognize that there are always going to be secondary and risk effects from other things people are taking it with. We're actually seeing it combined with kratom now a lot more recently. And then I think Utah is saying they're seeing it combined with something like cat's claw, trying to mask some of the 7-hydroxymetragenine within it. So there are always going to be risks of, combining two substances, or thinking like, oh, maybe my Kava will make it safer. It's not going to do that. Justin asked me specifically to look into dependency and risk of withdrawal. And when I looked into it, I'm going to say there's not a lot of information. And in fact, there are a couple of cases out there that have been published, and they really downplay the fact that the patients had polysubstance use disorder. So they say like, oh yeah, this person had Kava withdrawal. They were also had an ethanol level of 300 when they came in and were awake and talking. So it's like, well, was it Kava, or do they have alcohol use disorder or an alcohol withdrawal? Or they're using kratom or benzos or lots together. So I'd say there's limited. We do know that some users may escalate their dose, right? And I don't know if that's because of physiologic dependence and decreased response, or just more of like a psychological dependence and increasing your dose because of that. There are some concerns related to driving, though. But at traditional doses, we really shouldn't see effects on driving, and that's really what's been classically described. And like single acute doses are really what's been studied. So some groups, some researchers have basically said like, we're going to give you a shot of Kava and then have you hop into this driving simulator and see how you're doing. And then we're going to give you a placebo that you may think is a shot of Kava and do the same thing. And basically they said there's no difference really. Now, that being said, that's classically been with the noble cultivars because the risks from 2-day cultivars are well described. So people don't want to use them. But if people are just accidentally getting or selling the 2-day cultivars, there might be more concerns, right? We think there's a faster onset, more significant sedation, and actually it lasts longer with our 2-day products. And when we look even further into it, so beyond just the acute, here, take this shot of Kava and then see how you can drive, there was actually an interesting study that was performed in Fiji, and they said, yeah, it actually might increase the risk of motor vehicle collisions. So what they did is they identified motor vehicle collisions where somebody died or was hospitalized for at least 12 hours. And this was found from all of the trauma hospitals within Fiji. And then they did random sampling from stretches of road, and they basically had police like randomly pull people over and interview them and ask them questions, right? Had a whole survey. They identified 140 cases that were in the MVCs. Almost a quarter of them reported drinking kava within 12 hours, and 31% reported, almost daily use of kava. versus their 750 controls that reported 4.3% had reported drinking kava within 12 hours, and 16% reported almost daily use. So, they controlled for things like time of day, day of week, on stretches of road, right? So they basically had cops sit there for like a day and would just pull people over randomly and survey them to make sure they captured all times of day, in important stretches of road where accidents are likely to occur. So it's really well described. It just kind of suggests that there probably is a risk. We don't know the exact risk. They were saying six-fold increase. I don't know. There are probably some unmeasured things that we're not able to identify. Looking further, they're back into the liver failure issues. There are between 50 and 100 cases that have been published on liver failure. The true mechanism, not totally clear. But looking into them, 7 died, additional 14 have required liver transplant. So that's a pretty high risk, or that's pretty concerning outcome, right? It's not like, oh, I had a rash, right? It's not going to get pulled off for dermopathy, but the liver failure is something that definitely will result in removal of this type of drug from a lot of markets, clearly not the US. Most of the people were female. Average age was about 45 years. It was usually in people that had either other medications or alcohol, but it increased the risk. And it was most common in high dose chronic use. So, not just like, oh, occasionally drinking kava once a week or once a month type of situation. This is like daily use. And then it probably is related to the flavocavanes, but kinanes here, A and B, which is actually probably related to two key things that happened. One was the shift from noble cultivars to the 2-day cultivars during this like widespread global demand, and shifting from a way that says like we're just trying to extract the cavalactones, chew up, spit out, smash it around, or just smash it around, to this like ethanol and acetone extraction that's pulling out tons of different other chemicals from the kava plant as opposed to just cavalactones. So a lot of confounding issues that we're running into here, but I think the liver toxicity is definitely real, especially with chronic long-term use. I'll tack on, I just have some general concerns with herbal medications and naturals and supplements in general. So the dose, and I'm going to put in quotes, the dose, right? The content in the plants, depending on which section, which cultivar, ranges from 3 to 20%. So one, it's really hard to verify how much your dose is when you're making tea. If you're just crushing up the plant, right, and saying, well, my plant had 3 to 20%, and I'm going to extract 10 to 40%. Who knows, right? And then with extracts, they remove 30 to 70%. Sometimes they'll do standardized batching and testing to kind of like ensure that the mix is appropriate. Depends on how much you trust them, though. Some math example, and I'm not going to read it out here, but essentially, if you have a 5-gram plant, your yield is going to be between 45 milligrams and 700 milligrams. So essentially a 20-fold scale across how much kava, lactones of the active ingredient, will potentially be removed. So dose, I don't really know. There's also not, in my opinion, adequate testing for a lot of these products, and they kind of just slip onto the market. And companies just say like, I hope we don't get caught. There is a cluster of patients with opioid-like effects in Alabama, and a group from the Poison Center and I think psychiatry there actually went and purchased a bunch of kava products that had been bought by their patients that had these clinical effects, And they actually had them analyzed and they identified mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, or the components of kratom, in all 5 of the products that they bought. One didn't even have cavalactones, so it said it had it, but instead it had kratom in it, right? So this is really common with some of our like gas station, underground kind of substances that people sell. And then supplements and herbals are really not approved per se. So like if a drug company is bringing a drug to market, they go through, animal testing, phase 1 testing in humans, phase 2 testing in humans, phase 3, which may be, 1,000 patients. They submit all that to the FDA. They say, this is exactly how we're going to manufacture it. This is how we're going to test it, go through, and the FDA says, yep, you're good. Um, as long as you don't say to the FDA, we're going to bring this banned product to the market, they they don't even do anything at the outset, right? They might say, "Hey, send us your certificate of analysis that shows that you haven't adulterated it and you haven't misbranded it." Basically, saying you haven't slipped in some kratom, or if it's a herbal supplement for men's health, erectile dysfunction, show us that you haven't included sildenafil, or they don't even say show us. Eventually, they find it has sildenafil. There is some testing that's required: microbes, heavy metals, pesticides, chemotypes, and adulterants. Not everybody's going to do it, right? Clearly, the group from Alabama identified a bunch of kratom, right? It wasn't identified as having kratom, so it was clearly adulterated. And these companies may have a certificate of analysis from an independent lab from 3 years ago in different batches, right? Who knows? There's a lot of this area is, we're just trying to sell as much as we can and hope we don't get into kind of trouble. So what's the summary? And we'll move into discussion and questions. There is thousands of years of use culturally. That being said, it's not really well studied from a long-term use, right? That population had at most a 40-year lifespan. So we're not talking about people, using it from 30 to 70 years. And what are those potential chronic effects? It may help with anxiety in short duration studies. The data are not great to support that. You can see rare but real life-threatening adverse effects, liver toxicity being the primary one. And herbal products have inherent issues, right? Things that don't require the same sort of rigorous testing before being brought to market, really going to be, it's a little bit of a gamble. So my final verdict: we need more and better data to support use, right? If we're going to start saying like, hey, let's start giving Kava capsules to people, you know, we need a big randomized trial that says, yeah, this actually helps and doesn't have a lot of risk. I probably think that limited duration use, similar to traditional methods, things like, either the chewing up or just the grinding and, a little bit of dissolution, probably low risk, assuming you're not getting a 2-day cultivar and are for sure getting a noble cultivar. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will take any questions that you have.
So, if folks have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I can read them. Otherwise, also just unmute. You can turn your camera on if you want and ask too. The takeaway, Dr. Leonard, for driving was like probably not a good idea to drive if you've been consuming kava. Is that right?
Yeah, I wouldn't. There's really kind of mixed data. Simulation studies say like, yeah, it's probably not a huge issue, but we know that people who, chronically do, and you also don't know exactly what you're getting, right? If you go to a kava bar and you say, what am I getting? How much am I getting? They're not going to be able to tell you, oh, you got 250 milligrams of kava lactones, and it's going to be, 30% cavein and 15% dihydrocavane. They're just going to say, well, you got a shot of kava, We don't know, right? So it's hard to interpret these like very fixed regimented studies with in a simulator to real life getting it from a kava bar. I also tried to look and see about liability from like a research or from a like bartender standpoint, and there really is no data out there because they think that the intoxication just isn't as overt with alcohol. I don't know. So somebody asked in the chat, how can people tell if they're getting 2-day versus noble cultivars? Realistically, Vanuatu has banned um, 2-day cultivar from being exported, but I don't know that you can ever tell. And, people slap labels on things, all the time. And if you say like 1 in 100,000 have a bad outcome, right? How are they ever going to trace that back to you? So I don't know that you can ask, but I don't know that there's much of a difference in flavor, especially with all the processing. And a lot of the shots have like flavored because I don't think it tastes good.
Yeah, I looked at the menu for one of the kava bars here, and it was definitely mixed in with other very strong flavors to, I assume, right, mask it. Um, and I was a little bit kind of multitasking during your presentation, so I apologize for that, but it was necessary. But the concent or mixing with alcohol, will that amplify the effects of one or the other or both?
So in one driving study, it was shown at least that alcohol, so they did like driving or placebo, kava, alcohol, kava alcohol, and it showed that the kava plus alcohol was a little bit worse than the alcohol alone. So the two together probably have a little bit of an enhanced effect. It doesn't seem to be like synergy, right? So if you think about like, oh, I took a Xanax and a beer, it's like drinking 6 beers. Maybe it was more like, drinking 1.5 beers type of thing, but it will enhance the effect.
Another question in the chat.
Not
Is there a way? Go ahead.
Yeah. Not readily. No, it's, there's not, I'm sure there is, um, because that's been done in studies and looking at like pharmacokinetic studies. They've tested it, but it's not going to be something that you say like every hospital has it. So it'd have to be very focused and probably go to a specialized lab. Until there's a demand for it, nobody's going to do it.
I was talking to somebody that when this initially came on my radar, it was a discussion about kratom, and somebody who was there mixed up kratom and kava, and they mentioned that they were interested in going to the kava bar as a safer, non-alcoholic type of bar experience. What would you say to somebody who proposed that idea to you?
Like, I think at this point, you based on everything I've read and all of the stuff out there, it probably is. Knowing all the like acute and chronic effects from alcohol, like going there, once a week or once a month is probably less concerning than, going out drinking at the bar once a week or once a month type of situation, right? It really does seem to be a safer. It's different though. I don't know that it's necessarily an alternative. I think for people it's more of a calming thing, right? So somebody who's like, "Oh, I go to the bar to have one drink, I chill for 2 hours, it relaxes me a little bit." Not a lot of risks from that versus, somebody who goes to the bar has 4 and then drives home. I think it's more the kava bar is more akin to the like person who goes and has one drink. It's nothing close to somebody who's going having 4. Yeah, kind of thing.
Sure. Forgive me if you answered this, but is there a way like, so if kava, say from the plant is it has 5% of the intoxicating effect, and then the extract is up to 40%. Would the extract be like 8 times more dangerous, or as far as causing the issues with liver, or is there not a way to do that kind of comparison?
I, they didn't really start to see the liver toxicity risks until they started to do one shift over to the 2 day and when they shifted to the extracts. So I think the extracts are definitely riskier. I don't know that I would be able to do math on it, because we say like, oh, the plant, say you're yielding 30% extraction, and the extract you're yielding 80% extraction, but you're also extracting other things. So it actually might go from zero risk to risk. We just don't really know. Plus, I think it's hard to look back and say like, hey, look at this, historical use for 3,000 years, and in a group that we weren't tracking things longitudinally, people just died, right? Because science and medicine weren't the same back then, so we never knew why people died. They died because they died. So we didn't really know the previous epidemiology, and we don't even know our current epidemiology for it. So I can't do the math.
Thank you. Any other questions at all before we let Dr. Leonard resume his day? Seeing any, thank you so much for your time, sharing your expertise. I think really interesting. I'll probably go back and listen to this again sometime and look forward to that. And thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.